biedny piesek. Piesek pilnuje. Także piesek pilnuje pana, a pan żebrze. Piesek pilnuje pana, a pan żebrze. Tu na Marszałkowskiej. Także nie o to chodzi, proszę państwa, żebyśmy wszyscy słyszeli, jak szczeka pies, tak czy siak, no, pies pana pilnuje. I on nie rozumie, że ten pies przeszkadza, szczeka, no bo ludzie przechodzą, to on szczeka. No ale ten pan żebrze na jedzenie dla tego psa. No, żeby ten pies był mądrzejszy. Ale to widzicie państwo, to przekracza jego umysł, to przekracza jego pojęcie. No bo on chce sprawę przedobrzyć. On chce lepiej, niż pan sobie tego myśli. To więc pilnuje tego pana i szczeka. I to jest właśnie pies ogrodnika, cinkciarza warszawskiego. No bo jesteśmy na ulicy Marszałkowskiej, a tu powinien być sezam i już go nie będzie. Będzie ogród dla cinkciarzy. Ulica Świętokrzyska. Piękne jest. Czasu polskiego, proszę państwa, nie ma na razie. Zaraz będzie 14:22 czasu polskiego. Na razie bajeczki pokazują o wilku i o czerwonym kapturku. No to już małe dziecko rzeczywiście u świadków Jehowy wie, nie dzięki tym bajkom waszym świeckim, tylko dzięki treści ze Słowa Bożego, że jak wilk mówi tym swoim głosem wilczym, to od razu babcia pomyślała, że to nie jest dziecko, że to nie jest czerwony kapturek. No, także widzicie państwo, po głosie można poznać, że to oszust, czyli po prostu wilk w przebraniu czerwonego kapturka, który zjadł babcię. No, także bądźmy solidarni z Panem Bogiem Jehową, ze Słowem Bożym, z prawdą. Poznajcie prawdę, a będziecie mogli się zapisać jeszcze może nawet przed chrztem do teokratycznej szkoły służby kaznodziejskiej, żebyście się może mogli mądrości nauczyć wszelkich. No bo w kościołach to nie nauczycie się niczego. W kościołach to jesteście żebrakami, w kościołach to żebrzecie, a Słowa Bożego tam nigdy nie poznacie. Ani Pisma Świętego, nic w kościołach. Tutaj macie Muzeum Jana Pawła, tam macie Muzeum Polin. No to właśnie jedziemy do Muzeum Polin. I Grzegorz Braun co powiedział? Powiedział Grzegorz Braun, że tam historii wartościowej to nie ma oprócz papieru. Historia na papierze. Ale wracajmy do tematów ważnych, do tematów ciekawych, żebyśmy nie dali się usidlić diabłu, uwikłać się w jakieś mafie, w jakiś tłum, psychologię tłumu. Oczywiście wyznawcy papieża nic na ten temat nie mówią, no bo oni nawet nie wiedzą, że w Piśmie Świętym, że w Biblii są aż tak ciekawe rzeczy, które dotyczą jestestwa ludzkiego, człowieczeństwa, że tam jest list Boży, nie rzekomo przez was spisany jako ludzki, tylko że jest to list od samego Boga pochodzący. Także możecie uczyć się z Biblii, możecie uczyć się z Pisma Świętego. Zapraszamy serdecznie do teokratycznej szkoły służby kaznodziejskiej. Tam poznacie, na czym polega dyplomacja, jak rozmawiać z ludźmi kulturalnymi, no i niekulturalnymi, ale że wy, jako ci misjonarze, jako ci pionierzy, pionierki, macie być kulturalni, macie być mili, no oczywiście macie pałać Duchem Bożym, ale przecież nigdy nie będziecie jakimiś tam moherowymi, których to moherowych, o tutaj też w kinie Muranów wczoraj pełno było, bo byli Żydzi na zakończenie festiwalu filmów żydowskich niezależnych, no i katolicy, przecież świadkowie Jehowy nie przyjdą, świadkowie Jehowy nie byli, świadków Jehowy tu w ogóle w Warszawie, na Mazowszu, nad Wisłą, pomiędzy Bugiem i Odrą, Gdańskiem i Czechosłowacją nie ma, ani mormonów nie ma, ani ewangelików. Państwo zobaczą, bus Podlasie Ekspres, on przecież jedzie z Anglo-Ameryki Białystok. Państwo zobaczą, że jest pełen wypchany, pełno pasażerów, prawda? On jedzie z Anglo-Ameryki, Białystok. I tam są prawosławni, tam są świadkowie Jehowy, tam są mormoni, ewangelicy, święci. A tutaj to tylko, wiecie Państwo, ponieważ jest mydło i powidło, no to żeby przeżyć, trzeba zarobić na tym mydle i na tym powidle. Jedzie, zdaje się, dla nas 111 pod samo Muzeum Polin podjedziemy. No bo tak, ten Mareczek, gruby worek, nie jest w stanie, bo nie zna tej dyplomacji, nie zna tych świadków Elżbiety, czyli mnie podrobić, a ani kobylasty Janek Witek też nie umie Elżbiety podrobić. Tutaj jest to kino Murano. Każdą katolicy, wyznawcy papieża, Matki Boskiej, Ostrobramskiej, Częstochowskiej, Rzymskiej, Łacińskiej, aby nie krymskiej. Festiwal filmów tu był niezależny. No wczoraj się skończył 10, a dzisiaj mamy już 11. Jedźmy do Muzeum Historii Żydów Polskich, Muzeum Getta Warszawskiego, abyśmy mogli uświęcić wczorajsze wydarzenie, zakończenie festiwalu filmów niezależnych. Czyli, że zapraszamy Państwa do Teokratycznej Szkoły Służby Kaznodziejskiej. To Państwo, żegnając plac bankowy, bo jedziemy przez plac bankowy, będziecie Państwo mogli odróżnić, czyli że nie być takimi zagubionymi niewolnikami, kopciuchami, co kopcą przed supermarketami, kościołami, no bo tu nie ma ani cerkwi, ani cerkiew nie jest. A może ktoś przyjechał z Ukrainy, bo ja nawet tam nigdy nie byłam, na tej Ukrainie. O, z Mareczkiem rozmawiałam potem, z tym grubym workiem, jak już wyszłam od tego Janka Kobylastego. No a mówiłam, że ten Janek Kobylasty, no to on tak się błąka, włączając internet, błąka się po całym świecie, no i każdy go zwodzi, chciałby tu jechać, chciałby tam jechać i nawet tobie proponuje, ale to strasznie musza, wciska, także no chama. To co wie, to co myśli, że jest prawdą, że on tak tych Żydów nienawidzi. Państwo zobaczą, już mamy Muzeum Historii Żydów Polskich. On tak nienawidzi tych Żydów i wszelką wiedzę przeciwko nim chciałby na chama tobie wcisnąć. Nie daj się. Tu są Polaczki wszędzie, katoliczki. No wiecie Państwo, jak była stypa w Uszurmieja, to już Anita poleciała pierwsza, bo tam jedzenie, nawet wódeczki rozdawano. Pierwsza poleciała, także proszę Państwa, także Polaczki, tutaj nasze, katolickie, bo to wiecie Państwo, szkoła, no to przerwa, bo to po szkole, to przecież Polaczki, katoliczki nasze mogą, Polaczki, katoliczki nasze mogą, proszę Państwa, się rozerwać. Czyli najlepsza jest wolność i swoboda, wolność i swoboda. Pójdziemy se razem do ogroda, pójdziemy se razem do ogroda. Także proszę Państwa, żebyś Ty, mój drogi przyjacielu, mógł cieszyć się, że służysz Jehowie Bogu, a nie diabłu, to byłbyś człowiekiem wolnym. Zapisz się już dziś do Teokratycznej Szkoły Służby Kaznodziejskiej. Ja sama prowadziłam przez wiele lat, praktycznie prowadziłam Teokratyczną Szkołę Służby Kaznodziejskiej. No to mogę co nieco przekazać z tego, żeby się ludziom nie narzucać, żeby się z ludźmi nie wykłócać, bo przecież jak się ludzie pokłócą, no to kto ucierpi? Prawda na tym ucierpi. Ludzie nie będą chcieli słuchać. Powiedzą, że wy jesteście kłótliwi i tyle. No, także widzicie Państwo, no wyznawcy papieża, Matki Boskiej, Ostrobramskiej, Częstochowskiej, Rzymskiej, Łacińskiej, a nie krymskiej, bo nigdzie tutaj prawosławnych ludzi nie ma. No nie mają takiej szkoły, żeby w ogóle rozmawiać z ludźmi, bo niby o czym katolicy, niby o czym wyznawcy papieża mieliby z ludźmi rozmawiać, prawda? No. Nie ma misjonarzy, u nich nie ma świadków Jehowy, nie ma, proszę Państwa, pionierów, nie ma pionierek i tylko tak żyją jak te lochy. No to więc widzicie Państwo, żeby Elżbietę podrobić, no mnie Elżbietę, żeby podrobić, to jest nie lada gratka. Proszę Państwa, trafiła bowiem kosa na kamień. Tutaj mamy Jan Karski w naszej telewizji niezależnej. Też Państwo macie Państwo mnóstwo informacji na temat Jana Karskiego. Zapraszamy. I z Domu Kultury na Podskarbieńskiej 2 i zewsząd zapraszamy do reklam.
Now, it's a grand collaboration. And what I would like to do is I would like to ask the following people to please stand up. First of all, our chief historians, Marcin Wojcinski and Antony Polonsky. I want you to stand and stay standing, please. I want our scholars to stand up. Sam, where are you? And Hannah, where are you? I want my scholars to stand up. Curators, I want you to stand up. And I want all of those who are here who helped us in any way, Chava Weissler and Charles Stampfer and Moshe Rossman, and there are many, and Adam Teller is here. I want David Assad. I want you all to stand up. And any of our designers, any of our multimedia people, any of our managers, any of our whoever, because this was a massive collaboration. And I want to personally extend my thanks to you for doing an absolutely splendid job. And I consider myself an akuszerka, a midwife. And so I feel that we have given birth to a very beautiful baby. And now we have to take very good care of it. That's our task going forward. And so this grand collaboration involved hundreds of people. It involved scholars, curators, designers, multimedia designers, fabricators. It really was an army. It took an army to really develop this exhibition. And the days to come, you will hear from the lead scholars exactly how their galleries developed. And what I think is really unusual in our case is that our historians, our scholars, first of all, it's interdisciplinary. So we had not only historians, but also one of our scholars is a social psychologist, another's a literary historian, another's a sociologist. That the multidisciplinary and international nature of the team was a great asset. But also, our scholars were not consultants. They were literally authors of the galleries for which they were responsible, and they were involved from beginning to end. And I think this is actually the key to the intellectual coherence of the entire exhibition. So now, basically, what are some of the principles that guided the historical narrative? Well, first of all, what is the most important period in the history of Polish Jews? I was able to have really the impact that it has here, in the very place where the largest Jewish community lived and died. And to tell the story here, to recover this 1,000-year history, which has been essentially lost to the Holocaust, along with 90% of the pre-war Jewish community, this is a moral responsibility, and we feel that the power of telling it here is absolutely unsurpassed. And we are a site of conscience. And our task, and this I think is really something very precious, our task is to create a trusted zone for engaging difficult subjects. And what this does is gives us an opportunity to use a principle that I would call constructive engagement, which is very different from the model of education that you get from Holocaust museums, which tends to work from the, if you will, from a completely different premise. So the idea of creating a trusted zone by creating I would say, a history that can be trusted, and within it, to open up a space for debate and dialogue about extremely difficult subjects. And so these are, I would say, some core principles that are at the heart of our project. What I'd like to do now is to give you a little bit of a sense, and this will be a kind of a leap from the very beginning to the very end, with all the steps in between. But how did we get from the outline of the historical program, which was developed under Jerzy Halberstadt with a team of Polish historians and also Michael Steinlauf, who was a very, very important consultant on this project from the very earliest stages. Marcin Wojcinski was also part of that team. A database of every conceivable kind of material, photographs, books, newspapers, objects, which Renata Penkowska played a very important role in developing, and the master plan for the exhibition. In between 2000 and 2004, with the advice of Sheike Weinberg and under Jerz's direction, Event Communications, a design firm in London, really a state-of-the-art, world-class specialist in the developing of multimedia narrative exhibitions, developed a master plan. And after 2005, when the agreement was signed, in 2006, we were ready to take the master plan to the next stage. So the master plan really was taking the outline of the historical program, the material in the database, and it was suggesting a structure for the exhibition without knowing yet what the building would be, but just simply a structure for the exhibition, a set of principles, and some visualizations. And so this master plan, one of our first tasks in 2006, was to form the academic team as an international multidisciplinary team. And our first task was to evaluate the master plan and to agree on what we would accept and what we would change so that we could go to the next stage. Now, what's fascinating about the master plan, and this is actually what our concept diagrams look like, which is to say, putting the story in space. And I would warrant to say, and I think our scholars would agree, that it was a huge learning experience to take scholarship and to translate it into a visitor experience, and to work with materials that many historians don't generally work with, visual material, audiovisual material, and to do so in a way that is in our theater of history mode. Now, there were several aspects of the initial master plan that, for historiographic reasons, we wanted to change. And I would say, I don't know whether it's clear enough from this diagram, but essentially there were 3 tracks in this initial diagram in the master plan. One was called the Polish and European Historical Timeline. Then there was the Jewish track, and then there were trans-historical thematic galleries. And the first decision that we made was to integrate all 3 into one line. That is to say, that we decided that we did not want a European and Polish context into which we would then put our Jewish story. We wanted an integral story, a story that really communicated the idea that Jews are not only in Poland, but also of Poland, and that their history is an integral part of the history of Poland. So that was the first thing. The second is we wanted to avoid the idea of trans-historical thematic treatments of Judaism, women, the wedding, whatever it might be, but rather to integrate those themes, including themes such as anti-Semitism, themes such as Jewish religious life, to weave them in and integrate them into one coherent narrative. So those were decisions that we took on the very, 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 very basic structure. The second element was the idea of turning points. For the designers, it was very attractive to divide the galleries by what they considered to be historical turning points. But we know that history is a process, and that turning points is a little bit a schematic. It's a little bit arbitrary. And so we decided not to use turning points as the basis, and especially not to treat, for example, the Khmelnytsky uprising as a turning point. Objects, and there's a kind of treatment that gives you the feeling that you're in a gallery. And if you remember what we got in the medieval gallery, it's really very different. In the case of the medieval gallery, we only have really 2 objects from this 600-year period that are directly related to the history of Polish Jews. And those are bracteates, one-sided tiny little coins, and tombstones. And so we took a completely different approach. And our approach was to go to our text sources, to the intangible heritage of rabbinical responsa, chronicles, and that kind of material, to extract the stories that are relevant to our larger story, to illustrate them, and to hand paint the walls. It's like walking into a 360-degree, life-size, illuminated manuscript. And the story is organized in space. And that's a principle, that principle of narrative space runs through the entire exhibition. When we come to the next gallery, Paradisus Judaeorum with a question mark, here the Krakow model was going to always be central. But our realization of it, as you know from being in the gallery, is quite different. Here, the idea was that there would be touch screens that would then project up from around the model, which was rather, I would say, sunken. But as you can see, the visual reference material is 20th century photography. And one of our principles was to only use iconographic material from the period, or to create visual material that was inspired by the iconography of the period. And what we don't see here, because of course it's only one visualization, is how all the rest of the content would be organized. And of course this is what we produced. We have the Krakow model, and in fact this is an open plan gallery, and we treat it like a flower. And that is that in the middle, in the heart of the flower, is the Krakow model with an overhead projection, with a topographical scale model, and with interactivity all around it that allows one to explore the content in considerable depth. And then, like petals of the flower, are all the main themes of the gallery. And when you come into the gallery, you can see the gallery as a whole. It was very important for us also to open up the books that in many ways defined what made the age, in quotation marks, golden for Polish Jews, which is the rise of rabbinical authority, learning, Hebrew and Yiddish printing. And we were able to do that in a way that really make our multimedia quite exceptional, because all of our multimedia is unique to the content and is installed in a way that is consistent with the furniture and with the scenography. The Khmelnytsky Uprising, which we treat as a brutal caesura between the first half of the Commonwealth period, that is to say 1569 to 1648, and the second half, follows a principle we use throughout, which is to narrate through primary sources and through quotations from the period in the original language and in English and Polish translation. Entering the Jewish town, this was how the master plan had envisioned the Jewish town, that is to say that the central feature of it would be a wooden synagogue ceiling, not the one that we finally did, and that looking out from under the synagogue ceiling, one would have a look out to the Jewish town. And given that there is no iconography, well, there is some iconography, but basically here, these are interwar year photographs of marketplaces, and I think that at the master plan stage, there weren't the resources to use period material, but clearly we took a different approach. And the first thing we did, and this was Adam Teller's idea, was to create two centers of gravity for the Jewish town. One would be the marketplace, the other would be the synagogue, and that around the marketplace would be the tavern, the Jewish home, the church, and that around the synagogue would be actually Jacob Frank's story, which is set in the church, and new forms of leadership and spiritual movements that stood in opposition to, if you will, the normative situation. And that took us from heresy, in the case of Frank, through heterodoxy, all the way to Mendel-Leffin and the Haskalah, which surrounds the synagogue. But of course, our wooden synagogue was a gift in the sense that it was only in 2007 that we met Hans House Studio and were able to create this incredible wooden synagogue in the way that we did, which was to, in essence, recapture the intangible heritage of how to build such a synagogue in the absence of the original. Because all these synagogues were destroyed, it's not possible to have one with the original material, but we were able to recover the knowledge of how to build it by building it with traditional tools, techniques, and materials, and to do so with 300 volunteers and expert timber framers and experts in the conservation of the interiors of Polish churches and other related kinds of interiors. So this, in terms of community outreach, in terms of museum education, in terms of public history, it's the gold standard. And we're probably the only museum of Jewish history that has a church in it, which we're very proud of. And what we've done also with our multimedia is to install it scenographically. Rather than having computer screens and film screens and monitors, we've tried wherever we can to integrate our stories scenographically. Now we come to the long 19th century. And at the master plan stage, this was to be, these are large, if you will, boxes that would carry a lot of multimedia. And my sense is the intention was to communicate the story through projections on these large boxes. And we really came to a very, very different solution. We were fortunate enough to work with a very gifted designer who actually studied theater design, and his name is Arnaud Deschelles from Event Communication. And it's thanks to him that we were able to develop an extremely coherent way of plotting the story in space. And so, if you will, the long 19th century opens with the partitioning of the Commonwealth. And one of the things we wanted to communicate very clearly is what that means, because it's extremely meaningful, particularly for those who left Poland during the 19th century or before World War I, and really can't figure out where their families came from. If you ever really want to understand it, have a good look at the maps that are around the wall there. And so our solutions to the 19th century are really very, very different from what was imagined. Our train station with this wonderful multimedia that in a very quick way signals the main themes of the second half of the century, and then the emergence of modern forms of Jewish political movements, modern Hebrew and Yiddish culture, at the very, very end of the period. Now, the interwar years, how was it imagined at the master plan stage? It was imagined as a street, it was imagined as double height, and in essence, I would say that that fundamentally was preserved, but in a very, very different way, because we created a white relief surface, but we have projected onto the surface, if you will, the street and a whole series of thematic presentations. But essentially, that structure, I think, is very, very much intact. Our organization of the street into 4 thematic areas is something that we very much developed after the master plan stage. So politics, culture, daily life, and growing up. And I encourage you, if you haven't had a chance, to go to the upper level of the Interwar Year Gallery. It's really marvelous. It's one of my favorite areas in the entire exhibition, and I really would encourage you to visit it. So this is from part of the upper level, essentially inspired by Landkenntnis or Krajoznawstwo, know your country, through hiking and through appreciation of local history and local history monuments. And here we come to a really critical, I would say, principle in our historical narration, and that is that we try to keep our visitors in the moment of the story. We try to tell the story in the historical present, and to the degree that we can, in the first person. And where this becomes extremely important is in the transition from the interwar years to the Holocaust. And so what we've done is to, essentially, when you come down the street, and you're looking down the street, you don't see the Holocaust, you see people looking up. And it's only when you turn the corner that you see what they're looking up at. And so our narrative approach is really very strategic, and it applies everywhere, but it's especially important here, because what we're trying to do in this 1,000-year story is to avoid the teleological drive to the Holocaust, the sense that the Holocaust was inevitable, and that the whole story is just basically a lead-up to the Holocaust. And we think that this is a very, very important message. Now, this is how the master plan envisioned the Holocaust Gallery. And in large measure, the story was being told within a scenography of the Warsaw Ghetto. And I really remember discussions very early on in our post-master plan process, where there was a question as to whether the gallery should only be about the Warsaw Ghetto or whether it should be about the Holocaust in Poland. And of course, we opted for the Holocaust in Poland. Now, the Warsaw Ghetto is a very prominent part of this gallery, but it's not the whole gallery. The opening is across Poland. The Aryan Street is across Poland. Hiding is across Poland. The Barbarossa campaign is across Poland. So, but we are a site-specific museum. We're sitting on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto. And so as a site-specific museum, also we use the principle of pars pro toto, the part for the whole. We'd rather take one part, one case, one example, and develop it well than to have a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So this is essentially the way in which the scenography was imagined. And then, of course, our really, I would say, narrative space mode looks very different. And our principle of narrating from the primary sources in the original language, and in this case we have two heroes, Chernyakov and Ringelblum, and we hear from them from their diaries is a point-counterpoint. In other words, it's a multi-voiced story, and that I think is another very, very important principle. We come now to the post-war years gallery, and this is where I think probably is the biggest difference. And it's something I think would be very worth debating and thinking about in the days ahead. The post-war years gallery was, of course, to include the rubble, which we do, but not quite in the way that's shown here, and to include the part that would deal with post-war in Poland, but most of the gallery was going to deal with Polish Jews who left, and it was going to essentially be a gallery of 500 faces of Polish Jews in the United States and in Israel. And so you can even see from these schematic diagrams that post-war years gallery, the story of Jews in Poland would be relatively small, and the story of Jews abroad would be relatively big. And we opted for a very, very different approach. Our approach was the post-war years gallery would be about the post-war years in Poland, and that the story of Jews abroad, what I call expanded geography, would be a story that we would tell in the circulation space that connects all the galleries. Because that's a story that has to do with the history of migration, and it did not begin in the post-war years. And so here, you can see our scenographic approach. It's still very much inspired by the master plan, but it's also very, very different. And the way in which we present violence, which again is a multi-voiced story, is something I hope that you will really have a close look at. And I would encourage you to go behind this installation and to get the full story and to explore also what's on the walls. We have really, I would say the post-war years gallery has probably, it's a relatively small space, but it has very deep time because it has a lot of time-based media, a lot of film, a lot of interactivity. And now that visitors are there, we can really get a sense of how they're using the space and how we conclude. We conclude with the period after 1989 and the renewal of Jewish life on a small scale, an opportunity for the first time really to meet Jews who are living in Poland here today, because we do not use survivor video testimony in the Holocaust gallery, but also to try to come to grips with the enormous, I would say, Jewish presence in Polish consciousness, of which this museum itself is an expression, and also I would say that the Jewish studies, the proliferation of books, films, exhibitions, concerts, festivals, are all evidence of enormous interest in Jewish history, Jewish culture, and Jewish topics, including some of the most difficult ones. The openness of public debate around the most difficult issues over the course of the last 15 years, whether it's Jedwabne or it's CHCCE or it's the convent at Auschwitz, whatever it might be, these are hot topics, they are widely and deeply debated, and they are part of what we think of as Jewish presence in Polish consciousness. And so, with that, I invite you to continue to visit the core exhibition any moment you can find between sessions. And I very much look forward to the discussion of the state of the field and the future directions. And I hope that you see the fruits of your labors over the last 30 years expressed in this core exhibition. Thank you.
ładny wykład wprowadzający, a wszyscy teraz mamy przerwę kawową przez najbliższe 30 minut. Coffee breaks for half an hour.